Welcome everyone. We are now proceeding to the sixth session of annual CPCR conference. Now we have a diverse and interesting panel who will be discussing on the theme Methodologies and Epistemologies of Inequality. This discussion will be chaired by our beloved professor, Professor Reetika Khera, who is a professor of economics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. Her research area includes social policy in India, including health and nutrition, education, social protection, employment, poverty, inequality, and impact of digital technologies in welfare. So without any delay, now I kindly request Professor Reetika Khera to proceed further.
Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference in some fashion. I'm obviously pleased to be here. We are running late, so I'm going to scrunch even the introductions. I'm not sure in which order you want me to go, but perhaps we'll ask Gopika to speak first. Gopika Gurudas is a PhD student at IIT Delhi and the University of Queensland, and she works on Dalit and Australian Dalit studies and Australian literature. And I was quite pleased to chair this session because just recently I had the opportunity to speak to her about her research. So,
thank you. Good morning to everyone present here. So the title of my presentation is, Who is Afraid of Comparison? Within a certain section of the discipline of sociology, there has historically been immense restraint in engaging with the comparison of the realities of race and caste. This restraint, which is a form of fear, arises from the desire to maintain hegemony over theoretical positions that have the potential to destabilize violent and hierarchical structures such as that of caste and race. The need to exert hegemony over intellectual discourse, specifically in the domain of theory, is not new, argues Gopal Guru in the work The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory. In this work, Guru critiques the divide between what he calls, in quotes, the empirically inferiorized and the critically privileged domain of knowledge in anti-caste discourse. According to Guru, such a divide corresponds to a separation between what he calls the theoretical Brahmin and the empirical Shudra, where the high priest of theory, generally upper castes, establish rigid and exclusionary conventions featuring incomprehensible and frightening language that often cause anxiety to the Dalit theorist. Guru argues that such theorizations have effectively rendered the Dalit, in quotes, epistemologically dumb, sealing them within empirical ghettos where they await intellectual rescue. Similarly, comparison, both as theory and as lived practice, is perceived as a dangerous terrain as it can potentially expose the epistemic origins of several disciplines, including cultural and racial anthropology, philosophy, ethnology, Indology, history, and philology. This paper draws on my position as a researcher comparing the literary narratives of indigenous Australian and Dalit Malayalam communities, where, through comparison, I have analyzed how legal and narratological epistemologies of land and language function within colonial and casteist discourses in order to ensure the continued subjugation of indigenous and Dalit peoples. Throughout the course of my work, I have encountered contentions about the limitations and stakes of a comparative framework. So much so, in fact, that the framework of comparison is often forced to assume a defensive position where, even before it begins, it must first justify its legitimacy. Therefore, this paper poses the question, who is afraid of comparison? Clearly, those who resist it are neither anti-caste nor anti-race, as there has been a long history of comparative exchange between these two traditions since the 18th century. In that case, those who have truly feared comparison are the theorists who have engaged in intellectual gatekeeping, excluding anti-caste and anti-race scholarship, and thereby silencing the theoretical, literary, and philosophical merits of comparative research on race and caste. A genealogy of scholarship by anti-caste and anti-race thinkers comparing the realities of caste and race dates back to the 18th century in the Indian subcontinent. Yet, this rich scholarship has been largely ignored in favor of a certain position within sociology that is dismissive of this comparison. A well-known figure in this tradition has been Louis Dumont, whom Kamala Vishweshwaran argues, and I quote, raises the fundamental question of a comparative and therefore universal sociology, end quote. In Homo Hierarchicus, Dumont engages with a comparison of Western and Hindu ideologies by comparing the caste system with race relations in the US. Dumont characterizes caste as an exceptional phenomenon rooted primarily in religious values. Dumont concludes that the caste system is an Indian institution having its full coherence and vitality in the Hindu environment, but continuing its existence in groups adhering to other religions, end quote. Yet, as Vishweshwaran argues, for Dumont, it is through the act of comparison that Dumont is able to pinpoint the uniqueness of the caste system in the first place. Even today, the remnants of the exceptionalist approach to the race-caste comparison can be felt through a language of difference. For example, in his book, Interrogating Caste, Understanding Hierarchy and Difference in Indian Society, Dipankar Gupta argues that although there has been certain similarities between the operations of caste and race, particularly in the realities of exclusion and segregation faced by Dalits and African Americans, these similarities do not obscure the divergent logics that underpin such structures. Hence, Gupta employs comparative analysis to ultimately argue that race and caste are too different, as the complex internal distinctions of the caste system do not find easy analogies in what he calls the racial binary that underpins racialization. In a similar vein, Satanik Pal calls the task of comparing caste and race a terrible idea, as they cannot be conflated together, given how caste is more flexible and stratified, whereas race is rooted in notions of what he calls legal and pseudo-scientific physiological distinctions, end quote. Pal concludes that caste and race are only superficially similar, operating ultimately through divergent principles, and therefore the reckless conflation of caste and race can be, and I quote him, an affront to sociological rigor. Here, one can perceive that the language of difference or divergence becomes a way of asserting that the operative mechanisms underlying racialization and casteization are distinct and therefore ultimately incomparable. However, to reach such a conclusion, one must begin from the premise of comparison in the first place. Moreover, following Divya Dwivedi, I argue that it is nearly impossible to do away with a comparison of caste and race, as doing so would amount to a refusal to acknowledge that caste is what she calls the oldest racism, and that it was caste, with its history of 3,000 years, that provided the evidence for how communities could be dominated, exploited, and excluded. The refusal to compare caste and race is inevitably coupled with the dismissal of the anti-caste and anti-race scholarship that has been produced in support of the comparative framework across the world over the last 2 centuries, not to mention the anthropological caste school of race relations that has sought to explain racial relations in North America in terms of caste, the proponents of which Vishweshwaran identifies as Robert Park, Alfred Kroeber, Lloyd Warner, and Jared Berman. Suraj Yangde argues that amongst these scholars, Berman's work is particularly important as he drew important analogies between the lived everyday experiences of black and untouchable peoples in the US and in India. Berman, an ethnographer and sociologist with immense experience conducting fieldwork researching the Jim Crow segregationist laws in Alabama and understanding caste relations in North India in the 1950s, was able to argue that, and I quote, race is not qualitatively different in its implications for human social life from caste, varna, or jati as applied in India, end quote. While considerable scholarship has explored the analogies between caste and race, relatively little attention has been given to how Europeans were influenced by the caste system in shaping racial hierarchies. For example, Divya Dwivedi demonstrated in the inaugural edition of Critical Philosophy of Caste and Race that caste influenced theories of cultural and racial anthropology, philosophy, ethnology, Indology, history, and philology. Sumit Guha cites the example of the word caste, whose etymological roots can be traced back to the Latin castus and the Portuguese casta, meaning pure, chaste, and lineage. The words castus and caste were widely used by British colonists to identify strict hierarchies within communities. This is evident, for example, in the origins of the term half-caste, which was historically used to categorize indigenous children of mixed ancestry in Australia, as well as in relation to endogamous jatis of the Indian subcontinent. Since the 19th century, anti-caste scholars and activists have drawn comparisons between the historical and political contexts of caste and race. One of the earliest figures to do so was the anti-caste reformer and activist Jyotirao Phule, who in 1885 wrote Ghulamgiri or slavery and equated the horrors of the caste order with slavery in Europe. Dedicating his treatise to the cause of Negro slavery, Phule challenged and inverted the Aryan race theory, which was used by European Orientalists, colonialists, and Hindu reformers to uphold the caste order and propound systemic racial violence against the Jews in Europe. Phule writes, and I quote, "The system of slavery to which the Brahmins reduce the lower castes is no respect inferior to that in America," end quote. He further argued that at the height of Brahmin domination, the lower castes faced and what he calls even greater hardships and oppression than what even the slaves in America had to suffer. In fact, while the formal abolition of slavery in 1865 ensured the partial emancipation of the condition of slaves, no such hope was reserved for the untouchables of the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, the discourse of slavery, as explored by Phule and later developed by anti-caste scholar Sanal P. Mohan in the context of Kerala as caste slavery, can be a crucial entry point for comparing anti-race and anti-caste scholarship. Critiques of the caste-race comparison often invoke anti-caste scholar and activist B.R. Ambedkar to support their arguments. For example, Deepankar Gupta argues that, and I quote him, "Ambedkar saw no future in politics of this sort and that instead he fought to eradicate this cultural blot forever," end quote. However, this conclusion seems rather limited in scope. It is indeed true that in his early work, Castes in India, written in 1916, Ambedkar rejected notions of racial inferiority as a supporting argument for the continued oppression and marginalization of lower castes. But specifically, what he critiques is the emphasis that European students of caste have given to the role of color in the caste system, which according to him is not the chief factor in the caste problem. For Ambedkar, caste is not structured by a racial binary of black or white, but rather by a complex hierarchy governed by the principles of what he calls graded inequality. Yet, as Eleanor Zaliet remarks, that Ambedkar wrote to the anti-race intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois in 1946, stating that there is, and I quote him, "there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America," end quote. Moreover, in his later work, What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, written in 1945, Ambedkar employed analogical comparisons between caste and race, stating that, and I quote, "Like the Negro in America, he, who is a Dalit, is the last to be employed in days of prosperity and the first to be fired in days of adversity," end quote. Comparisons between race and caste have also drawn critique for employing a language of rights rooted in the ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom. Gyanendra Pandey, for example, is critical of a language of freedom, since freedom has historically been extended, and I quote him, "only to those who are deemed ready for it, excluding the colonized, the backward, the illiterate, and the Dalit," end quote. Yet, the crux of Ambedkar's anti-caste discourse was rooted in ensuring rights and civil liberties to the untouchables of India. Similarly, Kunnuguri S. Mani and P. S. Aniruddhan remark that when anti-caste Malayali reformer, activist, and educationist Iyengali delivered his maiden speech at the Srimulam Popular Assembly in 1912, he too appealed to the same language of rights by campaigning for the educational rights of the lower caste Pulaya community to which he belonged. A similar language of rights prevails in the activities of the Dalit Panther Party in Maharashtra in the 1970s, a party that was modeled after the Black Panther movement of the 1960s in North America. And it was the same lexicon of rights that propelled Dalit activists to present their case on the global stage through the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in Durban in South Africa in 2001. Through these examples, it is evident, therefore, that what the critiques of the caste-race comparison have truly failed to acknowledge in their dismissal is the epistemological clarity that they could have attained through an engagement with anti-caste and anti-race scholarship. In addition to highlighting the interventions of these anti-caste scholars, I would like to draw upon my own engagement with anti-caste and anti-race literary scholarship, spanning a diverse range of archives that include historical records, novels, autobiographies, and poetry from Australia and Kerala in India. A literary analysis of a few chosen texts revealed recurring thematic and narrative parallels. For example, indigenous Australian writer Melissa Lukashenko's Mallam Bimbi explores the complexities of land ownership, sovereignty, and dispossession amongst the Guri peoples in New South Wales in Australia. In a similar vein, the question of land ownership, dispossession, and homelessness has been central to Dalit assertions in Kerala, shaping their lived experiences and literary narratives. For example, in P.A. Uttaman's Chavoli or Voices of the Dead, the struggle for land emerges as a critical theme, reflecting the evolution of anti-caste discourse and their fight for autonomy. An analysis of indigenous Australian writer Alexis Wright and Dalit Malayali writer C. Ayyappan showcase narrative experimentations with non-linear and disruptive storytelling techniques like magical realism. In the Swan book, Alexis Wright uses a distinct dialect that aligns with oral traditions of knowledge transmission. Wright's strategy finds parallel in Uttaman's usage of a distinct Jadi Muri, or which translates to verbalizations of caste, which is rooted in the local dialect of Trivandrum, which P.K. Balakrishnan argues has been dismissed as a crude and non-literary dialect. In all these works, the inclusion of a dictionary or its deliberate omission becomes an intentional narrative strategy designed to shape the reader's engagement with the text. In such works, one can glimpse the emergence of a new Dalit aesthetics characterized by a disruptive storytelling style that embraces non-linearity and polyvocality, challenging conventional literary forms that have either elided portrayals of marginalized characters or have shown them as abject characters awaiting rescue by the upper caste or white savior. Importantly, all such works feature topographies and landscapes that have been considered as marginal, for example, like hills, farms, wastelands, and swamps. Through such techniques, the authors contribute to the framework of what T.M. Yeshudasan, an anti-caste scholar from Kerala, calls outbreak, eruption, and annihilation, which, according to Yeshudasan, is one of the central characteristics to the formulation of Dalit studies. For Yeshudasan, such a discourse would foreground and what he calls a counter-hegemonic critique to the dominant forces of knowledge production, foregrounding a Dalit voice and truth, end quote. As is now evident, one of the ways to achieve the promise of annihilation is through comparative research, because comparison has the power to unmask, unfold, and reveal new possibilities that was hitherto been suppressed. As I have illustrated, the potential of comparative research on anti-caste and anti-race frameworks is enormous and invites new scholarship that can be a meeting ground for the development of new epistemologies. Ultimately, such scholarship challenges the racialization and casteization inherent within academic discourse and thereby aid in the creation of a space that is radical and inclusive. By interlinking anti-caste and anti-race theory with a literary discourse, comparison reveals aspects of systemic racism and casteism and showcases a subversive positioning within language that challenges notions of inferiority. Thank you so much.
Okay, can I invite Safwan Amir to present his paper, Ordinary Muslims, Extraordinary Negotiations. Safwan is assistant professor at Ahmedabad University, and before that he was at Khera. He got his PhD at the Madras Institute of Development Studies. I'm trying to keep it short. His full bio note is in this handout. Perhaps I should highlight that he got his master's at the Delhi School of Economics and also studied at Ramjas College at the University of Delhi. He's currently working on a book manuscript based on his PhD thesis. And at Ahmedabad University, he contributes to building linkages between humanities and social sciences intellectually. Thank you, Safwan, for being here.
Thank you so much. That's really kind of you. Sure. Is it up? Share screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Meena Danda, Divya, Yashpal, and Lenny for this opportunity. I'm deeply honored to be sharing the stage with an amazing set of people, right? And the keynote address today was just breathtakingly amazing. So I want to just continue that spirit as well. Uh, okay, for some reason, the slide that I've prepared isn't up, but hopefully it will come up. I'll go along with my presentation as of now because we do have a problem with time, right? So I will try and chart uh, the status of the caste and Islam debate within Indian academia or the larger academic world engaging with the Indian subcontinent. The attempt here is to see how the caste and Islam debate has evolved over the past 5 to 6 decades or so. I'll divide this talk into two. One, the status of the debate so far, and second, approaches and interventions that I try to establish as a response to the debate itself. In doing so, I'm trying to push forward the argument that the caste and Islam debate, from its early affair with visibility and invisibility, is now entering into a realm where caste practices and anti-caste discourses are in conversation with Islamic ethics. Any luck with? Great. Okay. Yeah. So there is nothing drastically different in early scholarly works on caste and Islam that cannot be found in other studies on caste. So the premises are identical. So you have purity, pollution, descent-based lineage, occupational specialization, endogamy, commensality, colonial production. It also takes shape as a uniform justification for the whole of the nation, right? So it is also part historical, part sociological, and we often find sociologists taking up the role of the historian and vice versa. Most of these conceptual approaches are structuralist or functionalist and almost always ahistorical. Classification in North India has mainly been on the basis of the Ashraf, which is from Sharif, or noble, which is also to say that they are the descendants from Arabs, Persians, Turks, Afghans, and converts from upper caste Hindus, the Ajlaf from Jalaf, uncivil, coarse, uncouth, or converts from lower status castes such as village artisans, and finally the Ardal, or the low, the void, the rejected, the repulsive, or converts engaging in scavenging and menial professions. So, Imtiaz Ahmed's edited volume, Caste and Social Stratification Among Muslims in India, stands at the center of discussions on some of these topics. Birth and descent in Islam are usually linked to either tracing one's lineage to the Prophet or showing that one's ancestors were Arabs rather than converts. So putative links to the Prophet raises one's social standing, with the title Sayyid conferred upon such a person. Significant influences of the Hindu caste system can be seen in most works on social stratification among Muslims in India. Regional versions can also be found, but the four Varna system, which is also the way in which it's been classified, has been the structural favorite for most scholars. We find this fixed reading of history and sociology permeating even economic analysis on Muslims and interestingly influencing the Sachar Committee report. But let me just move a bit further. And one decisive moment that you see in the analysis of Islam in India that happened in the 1980s is where I think that the most important foundation for understanding caste and Islam comes through. So you have Imtiaz Ahmed, the political sociologist, who was at loggerheads with Francis Robinson, the historian. Ahmed sees syncretic Islam as the way to understand Islam in India. This, according to him, is the uniqueness of Muslims in India, since they take on both Hindu and Islamic characteristics, and such has been the life of an Indian Islam since time immemorial. Francis Robinson, on the other hand, holds the view that a slow but definite process of Islamization will ensure that things change over time in India, and Muslims will fully conform to a textual or pure Islam. Veena Das intervenes and has sort of the last word to say that the two sides of the debate do not differ much because they are both trying to bring about their own essentialist notions of Islam. Ahmed and Robinson fall within the traps of high Islam and low Islam, or what is now known as the great tradition and little tradition. They consider that there is something out there in the open, maybe in some mythical region in the Middle East, where pristine Islam exists. And this is precisely how much of theorizing around caste and Islam has also found its call. It is either denied by being shown as an aberration in Islam, or it is considered as a local or regional element among Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. Thus, further suggests that the best way to go about studying Indian Islam is not to reject the textual or the local, but to think of both as being interpreted time and again based on the context. And this allows us to push forward the need for, say, Muslim subjectivities as Muslims would conceive of matters. I'll pick on this later. These three actors remain crucial to almost every anthropological or sociological understanding on Islam in India that would go on to emerge later on, especially around ways in which piety and the question of caste would be interpreted. I'll come back to this again, but for now, let me also quickly address political scientists and their entry into the debate. With the intensification of tropes like, say, secularism and communalism, terrorism and nationalism, in the subsequent turn of the century, the Muslim became not just the political other, but also was limited to a political subject. Such political readings would pick on a single thinker or reformist from the 19th or 20th century, usually from North India, and try to represent the whole Muslim populace within South Asia. While these thinkers themselves might have never considered their voice as representative of the whole community, academicians framed the narrative to make it seem like an all-encompassing whole. Such analysis reads Islam as an object to be studied around a couple of important leaders, political parties, extremism, etc. This brief critique of the political does not mean that power as an analytical lens is futile, but these lenses ended up being myopic in bringing forward Muslim perspectives. It particularly disallowed the ordinary Muslim and the ways they went about life. The few who have thought around Pasmanda Muslims have located the political in a particular way as well. This is because they directly see it as a question of upper versus lower Muslim castes, the binary being quite prevalent over there, and they do not necessarily go beyond that. While being a crucial addition to the debate, this misses various points, including considering the socioeconomic status or options for mobility, or the kinds of negotiations that take place with the state for the minority community of Muslims as a whole. Some kind of balance comes up in the recent special issue by Julian Levesque and Sohaib Niazi in 2023, which looks at organizations around caste groups, including the Pasmanda and upper caste Sayyid associations. These might be as political parties, or as anjumans or Momin collectives that are striving to push forward their caste interests. What they do is to show how Muslims frame practices of social distinction in an Islamic language of equality, piety, or service. While the scholarship is excellent, and there's no doubt there, the concern that I would immediately point out is that they take the association in its modern form as the basis for understanding caste among Muslims without necessarily seeking the very roots of what pre-modern associations did and how they've been transformed in the past 2 centuries. If one were to think of anjumans and earlier guild associations of, say, artisans, merchants, traders, tailors, carpenters, metalsmiths, masons, barbers, it would have helped arrive at a couple of disjunctions that went through during the colonial period. Lanzilo's recent work provides one way to think about labor, piety, and guild associations in the 19th and 20th centuries. Guilds and futuwat, virtuous chivalry, are hardly thought about as well. And I trace the Salmani Barber Guild through their missing ethical manuscript named Kisbatnama to say how the very rules of earning a decent living is closely linked to ethical well-being for themselves and others. So let's move on to the second section of this talk. And I just wanted to begin by saying how these approaches in the study of caste in Islam has actually seen critiques of various sorts. And out of them, I would like to at least raise 2 over here. And we see that there's an exercise of immanent critique within the Indian Islamic tradition. And this can be seen best in the case of Masood Alam Falahi's work, Hindustan Mein Zaat, Paat aur Musalman. Falahi is widely read by academicians dealing with caste in Islam. Falahi does not merely provide a political critique of caste. His work can be read as an internal criticism within the Islamic tradition. he sees the origins of caste as an evil arising from Iblis or Satan. This is positioned in the concept of Satan's claim to superiority. After all, Satan is created from fire, in contrast to the inferior human being created from clay. Falahi subtly brings out the contemptuous nature of Satan, evil, and caste in the idea of a superior self as opposed to a seemingly weaker creation. This disparity in power is produced by the one who considers themselves in an alleged and apparent higher position. This foundation based on contempt and superiority needs to be taken up as a principal force in any reading of caste through Islam. However, none of Falahi's academic interlocutors have cared to do so. To read Falahi merely as a source to prove casteism exists in Islam is then to do away with the kind of engagement that Falahi's work else makes possible. Similarly, in the mid-90s, a Muslim barber from Kerala wrote an article elucidating stratification and its heinous nature among Muslims in the South Indian state. The editor of the Muslim magazine to which the article was sent for consideration rejected the article, and the article remains unpublished to this day. Nor did the barber author really attempt publishing it elsewhere. I came across a copy of the article's manuscript during my ethnographic research, along with the Muslim barbers of Kerala. The barber author is critical of the priestly class, challenges notions of kafa or compatibility in marriages, and takes to task the various Muslim traditional and reform-based organizations. He builds on a larger notion of humanity, moves beyond racial equations, takes up verses from the Quran and the Hadith to support his arguments and makes a case against caste-based hierarchy among Muslims. What connects these two writings, Falahi and the Anonymous Barber, is definitely the popularity that they have among an unintended audience. In Falahi's case, academicians like you and me, and in the Barber author's case, barbers who now carry photocopies of the rejected article as a manifesto in their front pockets. What they also connect on is their tryst primarily against a certain kind of piety itself. And this is an important move because if you were to take the sum total of the scholarship that the anthropology of Islam trend has influenced, from a more global perspective, the pious subject is the most common trope. Cultivation of a pious subject or ways in which this piety informs one's worldview, how it struggles with or against modernity is almost always taken up. One will find this in numerous PhD theses that have come out of research scholars studying Muslims in India. It almost begs us to think of the question, who is this pious subject after all? Why have we taken it for granted? Why have we closed the ways in which we have defined piety? And Falahi and our Barber author precisely works against this to show that there is an alternative piety available, and the one that is in circulation is not only limited, but deeply problematic. So what do we do with these equations, right? How does one theorize these subjectivities? More importantly, what do we learn from such articulations? One scholar whose work comes up as an exception with regard to listening and theorizing Muslims around the caste question is Joel Lee. Though an anthropologist, he does the historian's diligent duty by searching for archival material about Muslim low-caste sanitation workers. He also works on the origin stories of the halal core community, not to prove an objective fact in history, but to show how Dalit Muslims engage with the past to provide a critique to their higher status co-religionists. What I want to do in this last bit is to take this approach that Lee puts forward, sharpen it a bit, and add a couple of specific interventions. I want to start by saying it's important, I think it's the most crucial bit, to take Muslims seriously, take what they say seriously, understand their practices, avoid considering it as false consciousness. To deal with their pasts, we also need to know how or what Muslims think about their own past, how is it that they bring about their own pasts, what do they talk about their own pasts. Once you've triangulated this narrative, it stays, even if it might not appeal your immediate rationale. Next, I would say affect is taken up as an important category for analysis. It's important to locate how it is intimately connected to how caste is perpetual and perpetuated in multiple ways that are ever changing. And if you were to move a bit more forward and really understand how ethical subjectivities are cultivated among Muslims, one would immediately recognize the value of effective categories. Understanding that the Sharia or approaches to the ethical are not confined to the binaries of halal and haram is also crucial, and hence recognizing the nuances within these rulings or ahkam, so say the wajib, the mandatory, the mustahab, the recommended, makruh, disliked, and haram, forbidden, is quite helpful. Building on connections between the larger ahkam, commandments, and effect allows us to trace how these categories have gone through multiple registers over the course of time. The challenge then is to see how ordinary people have engaged with them. Further, to think of what Islamic ethics mean and what caste practices are, how they relate, how they evolve, how they regress or progress, the disjunctions, everything becomes important. And if you were to also move beyond the binary of tradition and reform, which are both intricately caught up in modernity, to the extent that they both subjugate lower status Muslim groups to ensure their own status. So it's important to also try and push beyond this binary of fixating around the traditional or the reform. But what I would like to reaffirm is that the ordinary is deeply intertwined with the larger Islamic tradition. Hence, what are apparently known as accretions are not necessarily outside the fold of Islamic tradition, but an engagement with multiple traditions. Modernity and its liberal secular episteme being one of the most important ones today. And these engagements have been organic in many avenues, while fraught in many more. I will end by suggesting that while the caste and Islam debate seems to be over, we need to usher in more crucial discussions around Islamic ethics and caste practices. Thank you.
The last speaker for this session is Divya. Divya Dwivedi requested me to introduce her as my dear colleague and skip the rest of her introduction. I'm sure most of you are already aware of her and her work. I'd invite Divya to.
Thank you very much, Reetika, and thank you, Gopika, first of all, for having discussed so incisively the problem of opposition to or resistance to comparisons. I'm going to, in a way, build on what Gopika has already delineated. But I also want to say in a prefatory note that I have been fortunate to work with a community of research scholars in my capacity as a supervisor, but work with them. And I must mention Arushi Punya, who's also here in the audience and has recently graduated and published comparative work, because I think working in this community helped me to continue to think about why this resistance to comparisons and what is the value of comparisons, what do they open us to think further. And that is what I want to speak about today. I've used this word in my title, Marginalysis. I would, on another occasion, elaborate on the many senses of margins and the different kinds of marginalysis that correspond to these senses of margins. But to summarize it quickly, I would say that margins have come to denote something dominant in one's dominant sense, something romantic, because this term margins has been invested with a sense of something suppressed which must be recuperated, but also which must be maintained in its difference, and it must be saved from extinction. There is an ambivalence, an ambiguity, both ethical and political, in this romantic approach to margins. And it flies back in our face when we term certain threatening far-right formations as fringe. This would be one very contemporary example of how we use the semantic chain of margins. And when we call certain formations fringe, we actually marginalize something which is every day evidently major and more powerful. We also misrepresent it metaphorically as something far from the center, whereas today it has acquired a central position, and that trajectory itself is more revealing than the mere description of a center and a margin. it is therefore not the case that texts or formations, discourses, and even peoples don't suffer the strategies of marginalization. We know historically that there is marginalization. We also often use this term as, I don't know why, but a more polite synonym for saying lower caste, for saying Dalit, for saying oppressed, and other synonyms. So there is marginalization, but at the same time, for that very reason, there is a confusion in our desires to end marginalization for some of these historic formations, but also to preserve and even celebrate the marginal existence of certain others. And that is why we need to address the ambivalence of this semantic chain. And at a theoretical level, the semantic chain extends to terms like mark, edge, border, boundary. I'm sure many of us think of Jacques Derrida's analyses of this semantic chain. And I would suggest that we need to carefully analyze first those marks which obtain margins while hiding themselves. And this is the classical locus of Derridian deconstruction, margins that actually disguise and hide themselves. The second is borders and the study or the marginalysis of borders, which highlight and legibilize margins. They actually show us the operation of margins. And again, the classical locus here should be critical philosophy of race and Robert Bernasconi's work, where he called race a border concept because it produces borders between communities and peoples, and it polices those borders. And the third sense I want to highlight today is those boundaries which preserve margins by punishing their transgression. Of course, the classical locus for us at least is the caste system. It is untouchability and various grades of untouchability, which also mix with other margins by hiding themselves. And so the punishment of transgressions of borders of purity and power together, they produce marginalized and disempowered groups. They also produce what can be called the rejectamenta of social hierarchies, such as refugees, people without citizenships, migrants who are stigmatized. And as Professor Rolwa Puya showed us yesterday, they also produce invisibilized citizens who are part citizens and part other, national other. So again, I broadly propose that to the logic of these many senses of margins and the different valences should correspond a marginalysis. And I would propose, building on the works of Arushi Punya, Gopika, and so many other scholars, Meena Dhanda is here, one of the prominent voices in defending the caste-race comparisons, that marginalysis is bound to involve at least three, let's call them methods provisionally, approaches. The first is comparisons, the second is analogy, and the third is homology. And now, to come to the critical philosophy of caste and race, I would say that marginalysis has already proceeded since a long time ago. Professor Gajendra Nayature this morning presented a glimpse of a rich history of not only the resistance to what he described aptly as Pax Pramanica, but which shows that this production of anti-caste thought, counter-caste thought, its many idioms, they have already been marginalyses, which are analyses of margins, but they are also analyses from the margins. And I think that is what we must all carry forward and expand. So today I'm going to take a new locus classicus for marginalysis, and it's not simply an alternative. I think, to echo the phrase of Frantz Fanon, although he used it negatively against Sartre, I would say that the Durban campaign in the World Conference Against Racism by the NCDHR, by a whole group of Dalit activists and NGOs, to discuss caste as a kind of racism in 2001 in South Africa, it marks a date in the marginalysis of caste and race. And I want to just today explain why I think it marks a date. This Dalit campaign in Durban was a marginalysis. It opened new methodological and epistemological parentheses. Parentheses being those digressive asides which actually allow us to open into new ways of thinking, cutting the flow of the dominant discourse. Parentheses also as a kind of margin. So in 2001, a collective of Dalit organizations, along with similar anti-racist and anti-caste organizations from many countries, including Nepal and Japan, raised the problem of the caste order and its practice in the various countries, but particularly in India. Many of us know this story, so I'm not going to go into its details. But why this marginalysis is so salient and must be celebrated and studied further is because this was the first time that the world's ethical but also legal scrutiny fell on caste publicly. Ethical scrutiny had fallen earlier, especially in India. There had been anti-caste discourse, resistance, mobilization before Durban 2001, but the legal scrutiny fell like never before. The Durban campaign not only introduced but also provoked a growing avalanche of commentary and research from the margins, which the upper caste opposition to Durban has continuously and assiduously sought to keep in the margins and to prevent from becoming major. So Durban is a marginalysis precisely because it started a comparison. It started with comparison, but it was not merely comparative. And I'm going to now come back to some observations about the impact of this Durban campaign by first of all suggesting that comparativity by itself is insufficient analysis. And as Gopika pointed out, even that insufficient analysis faces so much resistance and also academic and intellectual stigmatization. We, as Gajendran said, we must be doing something right to have earned this opposition from the upper caste epistemology. Now, why is comparativity insufficient? It's because comparisons can be made between any two things based on a possibly infinite number of previously chosen criteria, in view of which criteria the compared things are examined for resemblances, but also for differences. So comparison is not a negation of difference, as we are often made afraid of. In this sense, only the similar are compared, although comparison always turns up dissimilarities. Comparisons can be applied to the selected things by overlooking a range of other comparables in the Derridian sense. Comparisons are bound to be selective. Everything cannot be compared at the same time in all its aspects. And therefore, comparison is also somewhat neutral. It is not by itself a commitment to deriving a greater number of similarities. We are open-minded about its outcomes. Comparisons need not necessarily lead us to what I call analogy, but when they do, they become openings into a deeper insight about social, political, ethical, aesthetic phenomena. Analogies are detected between the relations which obtain between the compared relata. And these relations are of the form of functions. They are not merely attributes, but ways in which things are co-articulated for a certain functionality, which means a certain repeatability and regularity, and that gives them social force. In politics, therefore, what we compare and then the analogies that we value are the analogies of functions of the kind rule, govern, control, dominate, denigrate, resist, and fight. And I must add, create. Identifying analogies in two different regularities, which often in other kinds of research we call situations, or we may call them contexts. Identifying analogies does not commit us to positing the sameness or even equality between the two formations. And so the enormous literature which continues to warn us against quote-unquote generalizing or quote-unquote universalizing by means of comparisons and analogies of historical contexts is proverbially barking up the wrong tree or even a non-existent tree. In politics, as we know, a poor analogy can be corrected with a better analogy, to be judged only in accordance with the aims of politics, which, following Shaj Mohan, we could also call teleographs. Let us make these teleographs or maps of ends evident, and then judge whether an analogy is productive, ethical, truthful, or not. In all cases, the functions of these analogies lead either to an analogical transfer, which is the creative part of analogies, having discerned a reality in one formation, transferring it to a newly created reality. In other words, analogy is the opening to a new political technology, an ethical technology. And this is what the anti-caste, anti-race comparisons and analogies have actually done. They have shown us. They are political analogies which served, first of all, as transnational alliances. As Kamala Vishweshwaran and many others, Nico Slate, have argued, they also provided an idiom of intelligibility or translation. As Meena Dhanda has pointed out, they provided a strategic concurrence. And once again, the opposition to this concurrence, not only in India, but in UK, and above all in Durban, shows us again the force which must be opposed by the defenders of upper caste epistemologies and formations. But in 2001 in Durban, the attention of the world fell on the caste system with respect to the potential analogies with race, and it invited, and here is the analogical transfer that was so disturbing, it invited the imposition, the invocation of a legal framework which would have outcomes, which is why paragraph 73 of the Durban Declaration was opposed by the Indian government and by the Indian sociologists. In fact, they were all post-colonial sociologists. So the opinion in this matter fell into two categories. One was either to promote analogies as merely translational and to inhibit the analogical transfer, since it's only a communicative strategy. And the second was to prophesy the failure of the transfer, if there was an analogical transfer, by means of imposing the United Nations norms against the caste system, the failure since they partake of powers that will assure this failure. In this sense, this is also a criticism of Durban, which was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was set up from the beginning by greater powers to fail. But I think in its inspirational value today, it never failed. So what did this new force of Durban help us to think since then, as growing scholarship has shown? It has helped us to confirm that caste and race are similar, not in every historical detail or conjuncture, but in having common the hypophysics of man. Hypophysics determines differential and hierarchical values as intrinsic to nature. And this is the descent-based discrimination in different mythological forms. Jean-Luc Nancy and Lakula Bath called it the Nazi myth. I think that's a misnomer, but it is still a powerful critique coming from Europe. We know that, and as Gajendran said, the mythological inventions, pseudoscientific and hypophysical inventions, whether of a biological kind or a cultural kind, let's find it in the word meritocracy, they continue to install futures of caste and race. Caste and race are also analogues because they have the same function, and that function is to include for the sake of exploitation and to exclude as born inferior. So the techniques of legislating value in birth through concrete life are the operationalized and institutionalized hypophysics. And Gopika has already invoked and so has Gajendran, the long history of the analogical transfers from caste to race theory, where caste inspired race theory. I will touch on it briefly, but I now want to stay with the context of Durban 2001. Do I 1 minute? May I take 3 to 4? Okay, then maybe instead of reading, I will summarize the remarks about Durban. By staying in 2001, let us consider the contexts of the analogies and the opposition to them. 2001 is 1.5 decades after Mandal and the opposition to Mandal in the Indian context. So we know where the opposition from within Indian government and Indian sociology and academia was coming against the Dalits in Durban. The second is 2001 is also the sharp turning point in the fate of another analogy, equally powerful and also used in India, which is the analogy with apartheid. Anand Teltumde in 2010 spoke of the hidden apartheid of India. The Chunduru massacre was mentioned yesterday. In that context, parliamentarians who were Dalit had in the parliament spoken of the apartheid in India, which continues while India shows solidarity with not only South Africa, but also Palestine before the massacre. But also that apartheid had already attained a canonical and analogical status throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and then the 1990s as the analogy for Palestine. So I would like to draw attention to the way in which not only a long history of analogies of caste and race with respect to India, but the dominance and prominence, the use, the ethical and political use of the apartheid analogy for both South Africa and Palestine internationally had already been major. It was not a marginal intellectual and political move. So the question then for us is, in what context, through what strategies, and with what outcomes is the very idea of comparison and analogy suppressed? And here, the importance of the context of 2001 is that while the Indian government and Indian sociologists were opposing the apartheid and the racism analogy for caste, the Zionists were opposing the apartheid analogy for Palestine. And the reversal that happened in 2001 was that the agreement in United Nations that Zionism is a form of racism was reversed, and there was a declaration in 2001 that it is racist to make an analogy between Zionism and racism. And there is some report that the Indian government actually lobbied with the Israeli government and with United States to allow the suppression of the Palestine analogy of apartheid, so long as the caste analogy of apartheid and racism could also be suppressed. There is a major global context. And in 2001, with the planes falling on the World Trade Towers, the fate of this date was sealed temporarily. I think we have to lift the cover from this date. And I want to end by simply reading out one sentence from one of the major actors of Durban, of the Dalit campaign in Durban, that is Paul Divakar, who wrote in 2005 that WCAR, which is a short form for Dalits in Durban, WCAR is not the end, but it is the beginning of a global debate on the hidden apartheid in Indian society through the institution of caste. It means that those who are asking for racism to be understood in terms of caste don't know what they are asking. But I think if we continue this marginalysis that was opened in Durban, we can show what does it really mean to discuss racism in terms of caste and to put caste at the center of racism, in addition to the homology with the Aryan doctrine already discussed. So thank you, and thanks to the chair. Apologies for a little.
Couple of minutes over, so it's all right. Can I invite questions? All right, and do we have a couple of mics to go around? Maybe we can start with Shenil, since she's right in front, and then you.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. It was quite engaging. My question is to Safar, and I really wanted to understand this one question. So who does this performativity of piousness actually serve? And I'm coming from a place where I've never found home in religion itself. So please take my words just as an academic critique as well. So because piousness itself and how it has been, how it operates in the everyday itself, and specifically how it impacts women and LGBTQ plus IA groups, how it impacts them. And there is, of course, a complete erasure of that question within religious studies, be it any religious studies, to be honest. And how does one really engage, with this erasure? Also coming to a very fair citation policy and its discussion to be followed. So also, like, when we really talk about, religion or its everyday effect practices, And I myself have been a huge fan of Sara Ahmed and her work and her life as well. So that's probably where I'm coming from, that how does one really engage with the violence that piousness also brings in the life of marginalized groups, and how does, you made a point that, you know, one needs to move beyond the binary of tradition and reform, and you of course place the framework of ethics in between, and I know where you're coming from and your work, how much it speaks for itself, but at the same time, I also want to understand how does one really differentiate between religion and tradition in its own self on ground realities in India? What are the actual loopholes where this, you know, these boundaries fade? And that's really my question. Thank you.
Thanks. Please.
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's a very wonderful panel with a lot of things to really think about. So I'll try to be quick. I have questions or comments to Gopika and Safwan. I'll start with Gopika, and I also thank Divya for alerting us to the many discomforts with post-colonial Indian sociologists, because I also belong to that category. So to Gopika, forgive me because I'm still a sociologist. So I just wanted to really understand the context in which you're comparing say Dalits or indigenous communities in Australia, because one is that the conversations in Australia seems to be quite ahead in terms of their recognition of indigenous self-determination. So I'm not very sure about how it actually translates into reality. But then in every conferences, in every events, there is a recognition of the land, on which, they are standing or they are, organizing the event. So I think in that sense, the kind of questions that, the indigenous communities in Australia, are asking and you are posing to the Australian state, right? So I just wanted to understand, how, you are really looking at, these two very different contexts. So the second question is to Safwan. One is that, I'm trying to understand, your use of the term ordinary. In a sense that, the first scholar that comes to my mind is Yet Fiami, who has written on ordinary Egyptians, right? In terms of, trying to really understand the ordinary, are you using it in opposition to the elite, or are you using it in opposition to the modern? So I'm just trying to understand what is the use of, the ordinary. And can we think about, the question of caste in Islam, ignoring the question of class, in the sense that, because the caste class, nexus, overlaps quite significantly to my understanding. So I just wanted to, hear your reflection about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. And then we'll, why don't we collect a few? Don't worry, there's time.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. So my question is to Safwan. So while talking about Muslim subjectivities and the internal criticism that's part of the Islamic tradition, you're building on, you're talking about Falahi and how he tries to link caste to Iblis, and don't you think that in doing so, he tries to ground caste more and more into the Islamic tradition? For example, in multiple pieces, he gives example of Kuf, Kuf not in the modern South Asian sense where Hanafis use it as in a different sense, but Kuf also in the traditional sense as caste. So don't you think that in doing so, he is looking at caste, he's making caste as an Islamic phenomenon, going away from caste as a South Asian phenomenon, and which may look good in theory, but in praxis, don't you think it will make emancipatory politics more and more difficult for the marginalized?
Okay, so we'll come here now. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have two questions, one for Divya. About the relation of analogy between race and caste. Coming from the feminist literature on intersectionality, they often attack this thinking of race and gender relation in terms of analogy, because they think analogical structures imply separability of race and gender, and therefore they took it as going against an intersectional analysis. So intersectionality is about not separating these two things, but if you think of their relation as analogical, you're really separating the two. So your argument seems to go against that, and I thought maybe you can elaborate why, you know, how your analysis fits with intersectionality, and whether it would be good or right to think of race caste as intersectional, or, you know, so that's what I wonder about. And my second question is for Safwan. So coming from a 90% Muslim country, I was wondering about a lot about Islam's relation to caste since I came to India. And remembering reading Nietzsche, Genealogy of Morals, where he takes the ancient societies as caste societies, and as thinking the monotheistic religions such as Islam and Christianity as implying a slave revolt against the caste system because they create a plane of equality. But of course, you know, although these religions went against caste systems might have infused and might have created negotiations with, you know, this idea of universal equality of all human beings. So, you know, what do you think of Nietzsche's analysis, and whether we can still think of Islam as fundamentally, in its, you know, like essence, in its core, against caste?
Thank you. Maybe we can take 2 more questions.
My question is to Dr. Divya. So I understand the significance of the Durban conference and how Dalits, particularly Dalit women, have brought the question of caste into the international platforms, which you articulated very well. At the same time, I would like to also bring your attention to, in future, how it could also be counterproductive to simply, like, of course, the philosophical foundations of caste and race may be similar, but the way caste operates is more complex, and those complexities, will they be also disappearing from the critical caste studies in case if it is like caste and race as comparisons, but is caste simply race? Because also Ambedkar in Slaves and Untouchables compares the slaves in American society with untouchables and speaks about what are the psychological implications of not just the physical forms of violence, but also the non-physical forms of slavery and violence, which operates as a obstruction to ever get free from the caste system. Also, I'm thinking aloud at this point as caste as a graded inequalities of, you know, the system of graded inequalities where, you know, it's not simply the binary of Brahmin, Dalit, but also what others live as caste, and, you know, what their subjugation from sometimes, you know, from the immediate superior caste or, you know, Brahmins. So those intricacies and the nuances, will they get lost in simply comparing the caste with races? You know, my apprehension, but at the same time, I understand this is the crux of this whole seminar, but, you know, we can also debate this theme. Yeah. Thank you.
And the last one before we go, okay, I'll come to you, but just the last one here.
Okay, hi. My question is for Safwan. I was wondering about how the ideas of ordinary Muslim and the pious subject linked in your framework. I was wondering about how are the ideas of the ordinary Muslim and the pious subject linked in your framework, linked in your theoretical framework. Is being ordinary one of the defining characteristics of the pious subject? And also, how exactly do you define the category of ordinary?
Thank you. So the last one, okay. All right, there's one at the back, and then since you're a guest, you'll have the last one.
Thanks. My question is for Gopika and Professor Divya both. I think the thing about comparisons is that racist techniques all over the world have always been informed by each other. So those comparisons have always been made. But at the same time, that whenever oppressed communities make comparisons, those are the ones that are always shot down. And Professor Divya, I'm thinking of whether we can also think about the denigrate, dominate function working here in terms of how racist techniques can inform each other and at the same time dominate the comparative framework, but denigrate the kind of comparisons that are made by oppressed communities. Thanks.
Thank you. I think your mic is not on.
Yeah. Now you can hear? Okay. Quickly, of course, all the papers were fantastic. Really enjoyed them. And Safwan, I just wanted to say, because three people have already talked about the ordinary, and I wondered if, because you cited Veena Das as the person who arbitrated between the two opposing sides, and Veena Das is, as an anthropologist, certainly following ordinary language philosophy. So she follows Wittgenstein, and then she follows Stanley Cavell. And all of her work is very influenced by the style of doing philosophy, which is, even though she's an anthropologist, but so I was wondering whether the ordinary is somehow connected to Veena Das's approach. Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe we'll go in the same order. Gopika, do you want to go first?
I'll first answer Professor Pua's question. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. So you are quite right in pointing out that there are certain historical and as well as political dissimilarities between the way how colonialism has worked in Australia and how casteism works in India. For instance, to point out the first basic difference is that the race relations in Australia with respect to the white/the indigenous in Australia has a history of only about 300 years, starting from the 1700s, right? But in India, it dates back to almost 3,000 years. So the way in which I'm making the comparison, and when I make the comparison, a comparison is for me a methodological tool, not only to highlight the functional similarities in the way that how racialization can work to functionally isolate, exclude, and even perpetuate discrimination amongst large groups of people in both these continents, but also to provide and also to underscore certain divergences in their present-day conditions. For example, I pointed out in my paper, I talked about how anti-caste scholars like B.R. Ambedkar, Iyengar, and also in the Durban conference, there was a recourse to the language of rights, which has been dismissed by certain sociologists like Gyanendra Pandey. But in the context of indigenous Australia, the legal scholar Eileen Morton Robinson actually critiques the language of rights in Australia, because she points out that in Australia, even though it has gone a long way forward in maintaining and ensuring that the rights of self-determination are partially given to indigenous Australians, the language of rights in Australia has remained rooted in a very racial, white, and what she calls a patriarchal ideology of domination. So that's a very concrete example in which you can see how there are differences as well that the comparison brings up. But nevertheless, what I am arguing, and this is coming also from as a scholar who has been asked to defend my comparative framework over the last 4 years of my thesis, I am trying to argue that it is only through the act of comparison can you even come to this conclusion in the first place. And if there's no conclusion, then there is no, if there's no comparison, then there's no conclusion, if that makes sense. The second question was to Arushi. By Arushi, you're so right. Professor Gajendran's talk today was entirely about how there have been racial comparisons that have, comparisons between the ideas of race in Germany, in the UK, in the US, in India, and even in Australia, to be honest, because, I pointed to the term half caste, which is, which was used by British colonists to designate indigenous children of mixed descent, right? So clearly, comparisons have been appropriated by racist ideologies for a very long time. But it is when the comparison is being made by anti-caste and anti-race scholarship that it is suddenly a problem. In fact, Professor Meena Thanda, in her article, in her response to Suraj Jengde, says that the real comparison is not between race and caste scholarship, but it is between anti-race and anti-caste scholarship. So that's my point as well, and that's why I titled my entire essay, "Who is afraid of comparison?" And what are we being afraid of? So it is only when the scholarship is coming from an anti-caste and anti-race scholarship that people are clearly afraid. And the fear is due to the conclusions that one can potentially draw, which is to point towards destabilizing such violent and hierarchical structures. So thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I'll try and sort of summarize the set of questions that I've received. So one is around the concept of religion itself. And I want to state this very clearly, that the category of religion is very problematic. It gets more problematized in India because now, especially when we're doing academics, we end up looking at it as this wholesome category where, you're not really going to suggest how people live, lead their own life worlds. And it becomes very easy to then say, there is something called Hinduism, there's something called Islam, and all of them are, one and the same. While it might really sound good in a very utopian sense, people do lead lives through whatever perspective that they are coming through, and which is where I would rather use the term tradition rather than religion. So I'm very careful when I use a term like religion. It's tradition in a very Alistair McIntyre kind of sense. But why do I use it? It's also to sort of move beyond Alistair McIntyre and say that, look, a person is never going to be part of a singular tradition. None of us in any given day or age has ever been a part of a singular tradition. You might go on to profess, you might go on to consciously say that, yes, I'm part of quote unquote Islamic tradition or Christian tradition. And even within that, you might still go on to find that people are going through various kinds of notions, that they are, the kind of engagements that's been happening. But what I would like to add over here, and this is very important, because if you were to really think of what an Indian Islamic tradition would have looked like in the past, in the pre-modern, you really find that an organic engagement with the various traditions in India took place. And as Gajendran rightly pointed out, Islam is an indigenous religion or indigenous faith or indigenous tradition, however you want to call it, to India. I mean, to look at it as something foreign has been one of the worst ways in which a sociologist or a historian can actually analyze it. That's the first bit. I do understand that, yes, there will be violence of various sorts, which is also to then take up a historical trajectory in which traditions themselves moved in. So if you were to take the past 2 centuries, this engagement sort of sees a singular engagement, and this engagement now happens to be only with modernity, and modernity in its larger framing of liberal, secular, or however you want to say it. But this becomes the dynamic, or this becomes the only kind of engagement that is pushed forward. Whereas traditions would have otherwise coexisted, would have had violent, sort of encounters as well. But what misses in this entire last 2 centuries is precisely how a very particular kind of engagement with with modernity has emerged. So I would say it is more important to see piety as an open-ended category. The reason why I spoke in terms of, say, Masood Alam Falahi or even the Barber author is to also point towards other alternative ways in which piety is being contested, is being thought out, and it's available over there. So that really says something about piety itself. The question on ordinary, I mean, we have to understand that by now there is a large scholarship on the anthropology of Islam, which actually takes two shapes. It sort of diverges into two. So you have one set which is talking about an everyday and an ordinary, and the other set which is talking about a discursive tradition, which is to say that, so the first set actually goes on to say that the ordinary is whenever a person, this is a very bad summary, but please stay with it. The ordinary is something where one is ordinary when they actually move away from the Islamic tradition. So this is a larger conceptualization in which the global anthropology of Islam actors have actually spoken about. Whereas the other set is talking about Islam, ways in which people have seen Islam, the ways in which they engage with Islam. But what happens within the Indian setting is even worse, because now you have a set of academicians picking up 19th or 20th century Islamic thinkers and saying that they represent the whole of Islam. So yes, in one way it is actually perhaps not even against this particular set of elites. It's actually against who gets to interpret Islam and who has been sort of privileged through this entire academic discourse on not just caste in Islam, but understanding Islam in India itself. The question on Falahi, my point was more to show that, look, while Falahi has been cited for various reasons, while Falahi has also said so many things, one of his most crucial foundational work around Hindustan Mein Zaat Paat, where he actually cites this example of the Iblis, of the Satan, is something that misses across anybody who actually picks up Falahi, because it's precisely in that ethical bit that he's also sort of suggesting that, look, there are various ways in which you can go against and speak about anti-caste movements. So that was me trying to derive something from Falahi rather than speaking about the oeuvre of Falahi itself. Islam in essence, the question that was put forward as to what is it that, what is caste and how does it stick within this entire issue of, Islam and its essence, I would say, and this is something that I keep reiterating, I would like to say that, Islam at the end of the day is what Muslims say, what they do, what they utter, what they practice. So Islam really can't be seen as an abstract entity, and it needs to be seen as something that is continuously being engaged with in various multiple conjunctures and disjunctions across time. And it's that, probably that spatio-temporal understanding of Islam itself that is important, which once again brings us back to the question of the past and how do Muslims engage with the past? Because if you really look at it from a historian's perspective, it's not a linear way of, saying that, okay, this is my past, this is my lineage or whatever. Rather, what actually happens is there is this technique of what Hadith scholars would call finding, and also a very Derridian way of, doing the iterable and non-iterable, where they would just pick up from random sources to produce arguments for their case. And I find this very interesting just to think in ways in which perhaps these kinds of Hadith methodologies can also be pushed forward into understanding the pasts of Muslims itself. So maybe it's about ethical time, maybe it's about ethical benchmarks that we need to be speaking about, rather than focusing on a teleological or a linear narrative of history itself, at least for Muslims, their experiences, the way in which they have gone through so much over the course of time, and they're going through right now as well. So I think I'll end with that, but thank you very much for these questions. But if I haven't addressed any of them, please do meet me after this as well. It would be amazing to just have a conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, I have even less time, but fortunately the questions to me, which were very good, were interrelated, so I will try to give a combined answer. Zainab, since you asked about the potential conflicts between an analogical way of thinking and the intersectional way of thinking. Many of us here will recall how one of the oppositions to Durban comparison of caste and race and to analogy spilled into the adoption of intersectionality in India, and some of the very prominent post-colonialist feminist thinkers like Nivedita Menon and several others opposed intersectionality, saying it was a form of conceptual American imperialism. It was going to produce a problematic culture of NGOization of political agency. And instead they proposed going back genealogically, always, again, Pax Brahmanica, to the Sanskrit epics, to heroines of epics like Draupadi, in order for Indian women to gain inspiration. So it shows that, once again, there's an analysis which is still missing about the relationship between analogy and intersectionality. Let us see analogy then as also an object, which is one of the reasons why I discussed this in a panel on epistemology. What is the status of analogy, and in different parts of the world, how it can be deployed and how it was deployed. Now, Uma Chakravarti's work and that of Saujanya herself and many others about the relation between gender and caste has shown that analogy is not just a conceptual or analytical tool. It is a social technology, because there's a temporary analogy between menstruating women and untouchables, because menstruating women are treated as untouchable, and Angel had presented on this. So it means that even for the coherence of the caste order in some locations, because there is a lot of regional variation and historical variation, we can't reduce that. But at certain points, analogy is useful for the caste-based denigration and control of various bodies, including women's bodies. Again, it shows that analogy and intersectionality don't contradict each other. They should be part of what we study even as historical objects. And the third point I want to make on the importance of analogy is that, which I couldn't include for lack of time, is that precisely the study of casteist, racist, and gender oppressive phenomena and their repetition in all societies demands us to think analogically, because we all, in a way, start in medias res. We don't have access to the origins of these oppressions. We have to arrive at them through an effort. And analogy, it's a historical fact that analogy has been used all over the world to arrive at a better understanding of the forces which oppress us or which make some of us oppressors. I mean, Meena also spoke about how some of us who are privileged have come to a better understanding. And analogy has been a part of it because it does something more than analogize. This is what I couldn't discuss. Analogy, once it surfaces to our attention regarding actual similarity of real functions, it provokes us to think about the origins of those functions. And I think more often than not, we start this genealogy of the functions by starting with analogy. So genealogy is one of the, you could say, byproducts or the eventual outcomes of analogical thinking, and so we should be patient with these analogies. Now I want to point out another aspect which I think speaks to Arushi's question to me. Why is it that analogies drawn in order to oppose oppression are the ones that are most frowned upon, or that we are made to feel that we could go wrong? There could be an epistemological error in these comparisons. I'll again give an example from India, which many of us will remember, of the way in which repeatedly there's a discussion of whether India social conditions, institutional conditions have descended into a kind of fascism. And it's often almost the same actors, in this case including the Communist Party Marxist of India, whose leaders have written to say that there's an epistemological error in making the fascism analogy. And if you look at where we have arrived after 10 years of this debate, I think this debate is also the setting up of scarecrows. So once again, as Gopika asked, who's afraid of these comparisons? It seems everything that is bad in the world must be excluded from comparison to whatever happens in our own country. And maybe Gajendran's move is to multiply the analogies. So today we heard of Brahmanical Zionism. I think this also tells us, why do we need analogies with external phenomena? What is it that is so suppressed in our own society's self-understanding that cannot express itself except through starting through with analogy? Third point I want to make about this fear of analogy is not actually a fear of analogy. It is a deliberate deployment of the scarecrow tactics, because elsewhere we find analogies abound. There are some acceptable analogies, and any conceptual transfer from one historical study to a different historical moment is a conceptual transfer, and it is analogical. And I think it's impossible for most academics in this hall to write a single dissertation or publication without taking for granted privileged analogies such as Homo sacer, biopolitics. These are all historically situated, located concepts developed particularly on the privileged locus of the Holocaust. And if we, some of us, many of us are attentive to this privileging and the peculiar politics of this privileging, I think these two strategies go side by side. Privileging exclusively of the Holocaust and what led to it, and the deprivileging of any comparison, either with the Holocaust or with other forms of structural genocide. And that's why I very briefly talked about Palestine today. What does it mean for us to say never again? I don't think this belongs to a historical context. Analogies, therefore, are also not only openings to looking for the genealogical and homological origins of oppression, but it is also our ethical opening to future action, because when, at least for me, I must say, this may be part of a kind of blindness, but I was immensely impressed and horrified when I learned about the Holocaust. It also took me and others time to learn about the horrors of our own society, how sad that is. But nevertheless, learning about any scene of oppression can help us to develop strategies to prevent future and present and future oppressions. So without analogy, I don't think we would have ethical thinking. And hence, without making analogy, and this is my last comment to Saujanya, we cannot, and no one does, argue that analogy should replace any other way of thinking about caste, namely historical, genealogical, and intersectional. But I think we cannot root out analogy from the various levels at which we make analyses of caste. Race, in fact, is as complex as caste. It's not less complex, and it is not at all binary either. So my closing remark would be that for those of us who epistemologically survey and map the use, abuse, and prohibition of concepts, are aware of yet another apartheid, which is epistemological apartheid. Someone is controlling which concepts can be touched by whom. And I think we should break down this epistemological apartheid as well. Thank you.
Okay, you can have lunch. Thank you, everyone. Please come back sharp at 2 o'clock, okay? Otherwise, we won't give you lunch at all.